Hi everybody, and welcome to our webinar on validating qualitative instruments. And I am so excited to introduce Dr. Ginevra Gibson, who finished when last year, just last year, and then
August.
August, yep, and then Dr. Crystal Sanders, who also finished in the fall of last year. And both of these wonderful people were in my dissertation cohort, and I was very honored to be their dissertation mentor and chair. So I am just so excited to have you both here and talk about this process that you went through as you were working on your qualitative studies. So I'm going to turn it over, let both of you introduce yourselves, and then we can have maybe just a brief conversation about why should we even validate qualitative instruments, and then I'll have you both present what you did in your own dissertation. So Dr. Gibson, start us off and give us a brief introduction.
Yes. Hey, I am Dr. Ginevra Gibson. So yes, I think it's been 6 months now since I've got my PhD, and I'm finally returning to normal life, and yeah, just it's a process to kind of just recover from, but it's been wonderful. I have a background in community mental health. I did a lot of work in the leadership realm of community mental health as a program director. And so DBT is my jam. And so, right, Dr. Bonfini, love DBT. And so right now I am teaching at Columbia International University, which is a local university in Columbia, South Carolina. And I'm doing the private practice thing, which is just new grounds for me, but very exciting, a little scary. So that's kind of where I'm at, and just really excited to talk about some of the work I did in my dissertation.
All right, Dr. Sanders.
All right, I am Dr. Crystal Sanders, and I agree with Ginevra. We're like a day apart. So like she defended on the 8th, I think I the 9th, something around those lines. So we're buddies in a lot of way in this regard. And so I have been practicing for the past 14 years, and prior to coming for my PhD, I worked in private practice, and so I teach full-time as a full-time faculty member at Trinity Christian College in the Southwest burbs of Chicago. And then still do some clinical work for a clinic with primary serving women across the adult women lifespan, dealing with things related to pregnancy and infant loss, postpartum, reproductive trauma and fertility and menopause and things of that nature. And so that's kind of my clinical scope as it relates to. And then I also serve in my faculty role as the clinical placement coordinator. So just really busy since finishing up my PhD a couple of months ago. I think Ginevra said 6 months, so I'll go with that.
All right. So, Ginevra, are you going to share your screen, or who's going to share? Okay. All right. So, yep, no worries. You should have co-host rights now.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Can you guys see that?
Yep. Looks great.
All right. We're moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
There we go. All right, so our objectives today is to talk about the Delphi, which is the process I engaged in for validating my qualitative instrument. And so we're going to cover that, review kind of the process for that and building consensus, as well as covering Crystal's or Dr. Zander's process of doing the pilot study to validate her interview guide and what that process looked like for her. And we want to talk about the benefits and limitations to these two methods, and really how this is going to inform your process of doing qualitative research and validating that process.
I don't know. Do you want me to go over these since I threw these in? Okay. All right. So, one of the things that I think sometimes surprises people is when they come in to do qualitative research, they think, okay, I'm just going to create this instrument guide and I'm going to move forward with it, right? But it's just as important to ensure quality of rigor in our qualitative research as it is in our quantitative research. And you will find this talked about in the literature in a couple of different ways. Sometimes it's called rigor, sometimes it's called trustworthiness, sometimes it's just referred to as quality. But I kind of like validity, and it might be because I have a quantitative training in the background. But I do like to still recognize that that's what we're talking about. We're talking about ensuring that our instruments have validity and that they're measuring what we say they're measuring, and that they're measuring it in a way that's going to really capture what we're hoping to capture through the qualitative work we're doing. And through this, it's going to allow us to have more confidence in the conclusions that we draw from that research. And I think, yep. So here are some of the things that you might be able to do while validating: instrument refinement through pilot testing. You can also engage in peer review. It's also, and I think this is important, I think this came out for both of these studies, is a learning instrument for the researcher. I think that both Crystal and Geneva probably would say in the beginning, they thought, okay, I've captured it. I've got it. This is what I need to capture in my dissertation. And then, of course, their chair came in and said, no, 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 you're not finished yet. You got to go further. You got to validate this process. Let's get some other perspectives on this through two totally different processes, one with Delphi, one through the pilot. And in both cases, you're going to see that the instruments did change over time. They did become something different than what we had initially. And so ultimately, it's going to make sure that your final data collection and the results of that data are organized in a way that's going to really respond to your research questions and your sub-questions. And now I'll turn it over to y'all. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to talk about the Delphi and that process that I went through. And just a warning, I have a lot of information that I'm going to try to cover in a short amount of time, but the information is on there, and Dr. LA has the presentation. So if anyone wants a PDF or something like that, you can get access to it. So first of all, what is a Delphi? It is a questionnaire or survey-based method of building consensus. And so ultimately, I'm for validating my instrument, my interview guide. I wanted to pull, I had a lot of different subject matter that I was pulling from when it came to different ways that my theories and what I was studying kind of intersected. And so I wanted to pull those pieces together and then get experts from those different areas to come together and find a level of consensus that, yes, what you've covered and what you are looking at, it matches up with what we know about the research in the field. And so building consensus around what I was focused on in my interview guide. It also allowed for diverse opinions to help, again, like Dr. LA said, refine my instrument. It is a multi-stage process. And ultimately, I definitely experienced this, but it did absolutely increase the validity of my instrument. And that is so important because a lot of times qualitative research gets a bad rap that it's very subjective, and we create our interview guide. And so the questions can sometimes be more biased, and how are we managing that? And so while we take a lot of steps to manage those things, this is an extra step to bring in a more objective piece to say, here's what we're doing to ensure that, like Dr. LA said, our interview guide is measuring what we want it to measure. It's getting and pulling out the information that we want it to pull out, because as far as measuring, like, it's not quantitative, but we want to make sure we have a level of a way to, something to fall back on to say, look, there is validity here. So the objectives of the Delphi. Now, Delphis can do a couple different things. Ultimately, it's going to help you get information from your experts that helps you know if you're on the right track. You're going to get that build consensus among your respondents in order to, for our purposes, validate an instrument. But it also can help you pull together and find ways of bringing an informed opinion on things that you might have missed, or where you have gone off track. Or it can also produce or expand, should I say, your understanding of what you're looking at. Another piece of this too is it also can, while we want to gather consensus, it also provides an opportunity for us to look at where there might be some diverging opinions in a particular area, and it helps to bring those to light. That's a little bit of a different thing than what we'd be using for our purposes, but the Delphi can do a couple different things. So it's a really cool a way of looking at different pieces of information. So the benefits of the Delphi, kind of what I've already said, it's going to enhance reliability and validity. It increases the credibility of our qualitative research and streamlines consensus. Ultimately, without a Delphi, we might be looking at getting a focus group or something together, and that can be quite difficult. There can be issues with getting a focus group together, and so this allows for a streamlined way of getting the consensus and the input that you need. So some of the strengths of this is that it's flexible. Again, logistically, you don't have the constraints of having to have everyone in the same place, time consuming. While it's time consuming for the researcher, it's less time consuming for the experts that are going to be involved. You're going to get their expert input. And again, like I said, highlights areas of consensus and disagreement. You're going to get a diversity of input, and it allows for experts to have a level of anonymity. And so that can, and kind of controls for some confounding effects that can happen within a focus group, where sometimes differing or stronger opinions can overtake other opinions. And so this allows a way of kind of weeding through that. Now, on the flip side, some of the weaknesses are, though, while it's very flexible, there aren't necessarily isn't necessarily a universal standard for an approach to the Delphi, and there's not always necessarily clear guidance on what to do with consensus issues. So I'll talk about, there's different rounds of the Delphi, and so if you're going past 3 rounds and you haven't gained consensus, while that is rare, because it's rare, there isn't guidance necessarily on what to do. So it is flexible, but that can leave you kind of wondering, what do I do to handle this type of situation? There can be a level of dropout that you have to consider from each round to the next, that you may have some dropout of experts. And so wanting to just be prepared for that. It is time consuming for the researcher putting this all together, and there can be some complex processes that you need to be able to manage, thinking about the quantitative and qualitative aspects of doing a Delphi. So the Delphi process, there's a preparing phase, conducting phase, analyzing phase, and terminating phase. So I want to dive a little bit deeper into those. And so I want to give it to you kind of like on a timeline and kind of share with you my process and what I did to conduct my Delphi. So first you have the preparing phase. All right. And so in that, some of the things you're already going to do as part of your dissertation process, you're going to pull together your research question and sub-questions, right? So you're going to identify those. So that is a very important piece and a step that you will take. So I'm not going to dive too much into that. You'll also have your research statement about the purpose of your research and all those things that also flow out of the research question. Yeah. Sorry, I have a big dog in the background. Then you have your interview guide. So you're going to develop your interview guide. And so just to briefly touch on that. So with your interview guide, your questions that you create, they're going to flow out of and must answer your research question and sub-questions. And so with that, you also want to take into consideration your theoretical framework. That is going to be the lens in which you ask your questions. They should frame your questions. So those are key pieces that you're going to need to consider when you're constructing your interview guide. And so your experts are going to then go look at your interview guide, and they're going to assess your interview guide. The cool part of this also, in how there is flexibility to this, is that you get to decide what your experts are assessing and analyzing within your interview guide. So you're going to give your experts criteria. What are they going to be assessing? And so there are a lot of different things that they can assess, such as clarity, importance, relevance, validity. And so you'll direct that. And you want to, I think it's important to think through what's important and how you want them to give feedback and help you refine your interview guide. But you're not going to be able to have them do all of these things because that can make it quite complicated. So it's very important to think through what you need from your experts, and then you ask them to do those specific things. And so you get to choose that. And so that's again, that very kind of a cool element of that flexibility in doing this. So after you get your interview guide together, you're then going to format your Delphi. All right. And so there are a lot of different technologies for formatting the Delphi. And so I've got a list here of different programs that you can use. I went with SurveyMonkey. I've, interacted with SurveyMonkey a good bit, so it made the most sense for me. But there are some different programs that are out there that can be used in this process. It's important to vet those. There can be fees associated with different programs. So it's important to check that out and figure out what's going to work well for you. But when you create your Delphi, essentially, you're going to create an assessment of your assessment. And so your experts are going to be doing some quantitative assessing and some qualitative assessing. And so on the quantitative side, you're going to do a Likert scale. It could be 1 to 5. It could be 0 to 10. I did a 1 to 5. You want to define what 1 means, what 2 means, what 3, all those different ratings. And so then you'll ask them, let's say you want them to rate the validity. So does it measure, or does it capture, is this question going to capture what I need it to capture? Does the question work well for that? Well, on a scale of 1 to 5, they're going to assess that. And so 1, you're going to want to clarify. 1 means it does not capture it at all, however you want to term that, whereas 5 means that it is completely valid. And then you want to define the scores in between, so that it's very clear how they're rating your different questions on your interview guide. And so you're gonna assign those numbers, and that's the quantitative side. But if I can do the quantitative side, so can you. It is definitely doable, and we've got wonderful professors who can help you with that. And so you want to think through how that Likert scale is going to look for each item. If you're going to do reliability, relevance, different things like that, how you're going to define that assessment piece. And then on the qualitative side, you're going to ask for feedback. Now you get to also decide what type of feedback you're asking your experts to give you. When is feedback necessary? And yeah, kind of put that parameter on that. And so, because you could say, give feedback, and then they're going to give feedback on anything that they decide they want to give feedback on. And so if you want to be very clear on those instructions, I asked for experts to only give feedback when they gave me a score of 3 or less, because I did not consider a 3 a consensus score. And so I wanted to know, if you're not giving me a consensus score, why? And so if you scored a 3 or below on reliability, please explain why you gave that score, so that I could then take that feedback in and adjust my instrument based on that feedback. So it's important to give those clear instructions. And so those are those 2 pieces there. The next part is moving into the conducting phase. And so this is where you get to define and select your experts. And so I quite enjoyed this part of it. So you get to define who an expert is in your Delphi. Again, there's a flexibility piece that just kind of flows throughout. You can pick the subject matter, the experts, and what subject matter do you need to give their input on your instrument, their education level, what type of experience should they have, what type of research should they have engaged in, or how much research should they have engaged in? And then accessibility. Are they accessible? Can you get in contact with them? Can they be someone that you have access to in order to engage in the Delphi as an expert?
So
And then
just,
there's,
sorry,
yes.
one quick thing. What happens if, say, the person doesn't respond positively?
Oh boy, you have a moment and then you recover. So yeah, well, I got some wonderful wisdom from a wonderful dissertation chair and subject matter expert as well, who just explained like not everyone's going to get your research, and you know what? That's okay. That is why we are all unique and we have our interests and our focuses. And it's okay if someone else doesn't get your research. You get it, and they're not the ones who's going to validate whether or not your research is, you know, good research. Yeah, just to be confident. And so, yeah, you have your moment and then you reach out to your supports. And you keep moving forward. You
That's
don't
right.
stop.
Mhm.
So, yes. And so, yeah, I had that moment. And then that was the only time I cried during my dissertation process. Had a few tears and then I recovered. But in that process, hopefully you're reaching out to many experts. And so one person saying no is one should be expected. Many of them will just not respond. And then, you know, some will, but and tell you that they can't or things like that. But you're gonna look to have about 6 to 15 expert participants. Now, that really depends on the type of work you're doing. And for a dissertation, you're not going to need 15 unless you're doing a Delphi is your dissertation. Then you might need that. But if you're just validating your instrument, 6 is going to be fully appropriate, 6 to 8, somewhere around there. Right. And so you're going to recruit at least two times the amount of experts that you need, because you're going to expect that at least half are not going to respond. And so if you need 6, if you need 8, you're going to want to at least reach out to 16. I think I reached out to about 16, 17, 18, somewhere around there. And I got 8 who agreed to participate. And so you find your experts through reviewing the literature, which by the time you get to the Delphi, you will have thoroughly done. And you're looking at I looked at my reference list and I pulled out authors and I searched them. And I mean, many of them had their CVs online, their email addresses were accessible. And so I was able to reach out to them, and I was able to determine, did they fit my criteria, and go from there. So you get to select those individuals and just make sure that you have a nice good list so that you're prepared for about half of those people not responding. Next, you invite them to participate. And so here's a snippet from the email, my recruitment email that I sent out, just asking for them to participate. All communication took place through email. I clarified my research question, what I was doing, you know, what I needed their help on, how I was defining an expert. And then I kind of clarified, you know, what their involvement would mean, what the time commitment is, what I'm looking for as far as consensus. And then I let them know there's going to be a timeline. And then I asked them to give me a commitment on whether they could do this. And very, very importantly, I had to get proof that they had agreed to participate. And so how I did that was through SurveyMonkey. And whether or not you choose to use SurveyMonkey or not, was a great way of doing this, because it took literally 5 seconds for them to click on the link, check mark, yes, I have that, I meet this criteria, yes, I meet that criteria as an expert, and I meet that criteria, and yes, I agree to participate. And I had them put in their name and click yes, I agree to participate. So that was really easy, and I just printed it out from SurveyMonkey, all of the responses, and I could plug that right into the dissertation. So it was very easy, but you want to make sure that you're not just getting a verbal commitment, you're documenting that you got that commitment. Then you get your committee to approve that you're ready to move forward, and then you get IRB approval. And then you get to do your first round of your Delphi. And so Here is a snippet from the official email where I said, yes, we're going forward. And here's my instructions for the Delphi. So you want to be very, very clear on what you need from your experts. Excuse me. And so you want to make sure you clarify timelines. But I was very clear to say I bolded, here's when I need your response by. And I made sure to try to be very gracious because I was conducting during finals. And so a lot of people, had a lot of other things going on during that time as far as, academia. That was just a tough time. And so I tried to be as, I thank you so much for wanting to participate. Here's what I need from you. Here's the time commitment you can expect to give to this and all those pieces. So you want to be very clear. I encourage tracking participation. I did not track participation until the second round. The first round, I didn't do that. And so I was sending reminder emails to everyone because I didn't know who had responded and who hadn't. And so the second round, when I knew who I tracked, I added a place where they could put their name in. And that way I was not sending them reminder emails when they participated. I only sent reminder emails to those who hadn't participated. So that was something I learned and kind of adjusted with. When it comes to consensus, there are a couple, there isn't a clear one threshold for consensus, but generally the research hovers around 70 to 80%. You can decide what that threshold is for you, but please make sure you have research to support what you've chosen to be your threshold because you are going to have to defend that. And so I went with 80% just to make sure I could fully defend my choice for my threshold. And so I was able to reach that threshold with the second round. But you want to, you're going to go through that first process. And even if you reach 80% consensus the first round, you're going to want to conduct a second round just to ensure, again, the process is about going through these rounds of refinement. So any feedback that you get, even if you reach 80%, you're going to want to still apply feedback that you get in the first round and then get that validated in the second round. So I went through, I had them do it in SurveyMonkey. So what's cut out of here is that link that they went to. They did my assessment on my assessment of all of my criteria, rated it, gave feedback, and then I got all of that information. And I went on to then analyze the data. And so this is where, again, I went through the Likert scale, pulled out the numbers, and saw what percentage of responses were consensus responses. And so again, we get to define that. For me, a consensus response was a rating of 4 or higher. And so I had to pull those numbers together. What percentage of each respondent gave me a consensus response? And so in the first round, I think I had like somewhere around 75, 76% consensus. And so then I had to go back in, make some adjustments. And so, let's see, in doing that, I applied my qualitative feedback. And so I wanted to share with you all just a little bit of feedback that I got. And just because there was a couple of things that came up for me, such as what do I do when I have conflicting pieces of feedback, and just in general, kind of compiling that information and making adjustments. So one piece of feedback I got was my terminology was not consistent, and I was using experiences of discrimination, and that was too broad. And kind of the language that I was using, and maybe I should consider a different type of language. Another one said the term microaggression might need to be defined, so I need to be more specific. So again, I was a little too broad, but then when I used the term microaggression in some areas, I needed to specify like what type, because microaggression could mean a lot of things. And so just to share with you, my dissertation topic was looking at or examining the experiences of Black female counselors who encounter microaggressions from clients. And so just looking at their experiences around that, how they process that. And so they wanted me to look more at, again, my terms. What terms was I using. And then another person said, leave out the term microaggressions, and that that to leave it more broader so that the client can define the experience, right? And so these are conflicting things. I also got another piece of feedback, which was interesting, in talking about what they wish they had done differently, or also looking at how they were prepared. Were they prepared for the experience? And that was a really important piece of feedback, because it ended up leading to me adding a question to my my interview guide. So kind of giving me some more things to think about in a way to further the research that was in line with my research question. And then again, talking about discrimination and clarifying my terms, and what am I asking my participants to explore. And then I had some give me feedback about open-ended questions versus closed-ended questions, and things like that. See, someone asked, mentioned about talking about how it impacts a therapeutic relationship and exploring that. And social identities, they wanted me to define that. What do I mean by identity, social identity, or identities? So a lot of like clarifying your terms was some of the biggest feedback that I got. And so how did I apply that? I want to show you guys the before and after. So I'll share that with you just a minute. So let me go back real quick. So I took all of that, and what I essentially did was I put it all into a spreadsheet. So each question, I had all of my feedback for that one question. And then I looked at the question, I looked at my feedback, and I looked at ways I could adjust the question. I had other feedback that said, like, maybe you should break this question up. These parts probably, if you want to get a deeper response, you're going to want to break them up so that they have an opportunity to respond to this and that separately. And so there was a lot of good feedback. So I took all of that, I put that into a spreadsheet, and just looked at it and pulled that together. And so I got way more feedback saying to be more specific in your terms versus broadening my terms and things like that. So I just kind of pulled that together and weighed that with what the goal of my research was, and that helped me make my decision on what ultimately I did in adjusting the interview guide. Because also the thing is like, what if I make these adjustments and then I get less consensus on the other side? So considering all those pieces, and thankfully that didn't happen. All right, so after I applied the feedback, then you would go into conducting another round of the Delphi and giving them the new interview guide where you've applied their feedback. And you're going to continue that process until you reach consensus. And so what I did was, here's a snippet from my email, and I basically explained some of the adjustments that I made. And so many of them asked for me to define terms. So I let them all know that while it's not in the interview guide, that I would be defining terms for my participants. And I chose to go with the term microaggressions for consistency and things like that. So I made sure to explain, here's kind of the some of the basic changes that I made and why. And just a brief email as I asked them to participate in the next round. You want to expect that you're going to have 20 to 30% drop off with each round. I certainly had that. And so I think while 8 participated in the first round, only 6% participated in the second round. So pretty consistent kind of drop off. And then again, explain the changes, and then once you reach consensus, you'll terminate your Delphi. And so you'll want to reach out to your experts, let them know you've reached consensus, you're terminating the Delphi, and you want to make sure to thank your experts and let them know that you've completed the process. And then, of course, you then report your results. And so here's my last piece, and just my initial interview guide and my final interview guide. Again, I had 9 questions in the first one, and I had 10 questions in the second one. one of the big changes, I did take a few questions out. So in my initial one, I had questions. It was a very broad question about your experience as a Black female counselor and how you believe that differs. While it was a good question, it did not specifically get to my research question and my sub question. So it was a great question, and it wasn't going to get me what I needed in this interview. And so that was what was so helpful for doing the Delphi. Other pieces, questions I broke apart, I think I talked about your initial thoughts and emotions, and then I asked them about what they said and did in response. So I broke those up. So I talked about over here on my final question 3, what were your initial thoughts and emotions? And then I separated out the question 4, what did you do and say in response? Whereas I think those were pulled kind of together or not quite separated out well. And then I added the question, which was so wonderful for the research that I did. Question number 9, what role did your education and supervision play in preparing you for the experience or experiences you described? And that was such a rich piece of my research that was not present in my first interview guide that came out of this process. My language was refined. There were so many benefits to this. So it was probably the most difficult piece of my dissertation process, but so much good came out of it that I absolutely endorse doing this and will do it again in future qualitative research. So that is where I end, and Crystal begins.
Okay. Are you going to control the slides for Crystal too?
Do you want to share, Crystal? Would that be easier for you? Or do you want me to?
I'm okay. I'll just tell you next slide, please, if that's okay with you.
Yep, that works for me.
All right, awesome. So I will be discussing validating an interview guide with a pilot study. I actually pulled research for both the Delphi and the pilot and compared to see which would be the best fit. And for my research study, I did a heuristic inquiry, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the upcoming slides. A pilot study seemed best fitting. And so what exactly is a pilot study? Sometimes we hear the term pilot or small scale, or we'll hear feasibility. But in particular for this case, in validating the interview guide, we'll use the term pilot study. So essentially a pilot study is the initial testing, in this case, of an instrument of the questionnaire or interview guide on a smaller scale. It's typically utilized in quantitative research, but it is definitely useful for the use of qualitative and mixed methods research approaches. Essentially, it strengthens the trustworthiness of the interview guide. And so we've been talking about validating and things of that nature. And so essentially one of the components is the strengthening the trustworthiness. All right. So some of the goals for a pilot study is essentially to assess the adequacy and validate the trustworthiness of the interview guide, as I stated just previously. Ensure the interview guide collects appropriate and types of ranges of responses. And so as Ginevra was just sharing, you have your primary research question. Potentially, you'll have some sub questions, and you want to ensure that the questions in your interview guide is actually, assessing and gathering the types of responses and ranges of responses. You're not in any way attempting to coach, but you want to ensure that you're actually measuring what it is that you're seeking to measure. Essentially, it also tests the questions for readability and comprehension. It really, you want to make sure that your questions are clear. You want to make sure that your participants are understanding, the goal of the question, and so that's also a essential component. And also, you want to ensure that your participants feel comfortable during the interview process and that the questions flow well. And so for me, one of the important things was chronology. I want to because I was talking about a recent experience that my participants, or I'll use the term co-researcher because in heuristics, a participant is classified as a co-researcher. So it was essential for me to ensure that my co-researchers, share about their experience in a chronological fashion. So next we'll go to the best practices for conducting a pilot study. And so one of the best practices when you, and most researchers will recommend that you want to get 10% of your sample size for your planned final study. And so since we are validating a qualitative interview guide, I'm just using the big five that Creswell utilizes. So the big five, if you're doing narrative, phenomenological. So for narrative, typically, if you're going to be gathering stories and different things of that nature. So that's typically an encouraged range of about 6 to 10 participants for the full study. Phenomenological, it can be 5 to 25, depending on, again, your study grounded theory, 2 to 30. Ethnography, because you're getting in the nitty gritty and doing more like field work with that one. And I'll talk about which of these two is it best toward the end. And then with case research, with a case study, you're looking to do about 1 to 4. So 10% of that sample, on average, you're looking to do about 1 to 2 pilot study interviews. Essentially, you may need to do more, again, based on the qualitative methodology that you choose. And so given those factors, your methodology will determine the sample size for your pilot study. Next slide, please. All righty. So for my study in particular, I did a heuristic inquiry. So essentially, I like to say that heuristics is the cousin to phenomenological studies. Essentially, as the researcher, you would have to have some type of experience, share the experience that you're looking to research. And for me, my study was on the tale of 2 pandemics. I was looking at Black counselor wellness related to the COVID-19 pandemic and civil unrest that happened in 2020, 2021. And so for my full study, I was seeking to recruit between 6 to 10 co-researchers. The aim then for my pilot study, as I just shared, was to recruit 1 to 2 co-researchers for the pilot to vet the interview guide. Next, please. So the steps essentially to complete a pilot study. So essentially first, because you're actually working with, you're going to be interviewing participants, you need to secure IRB approval first. So that's the first step, because again, we want to talk about the risk and benefits and things that happen because you're working with human subjects, quote unquote. It still sounds like a very sterile term, but that's the terminology we use in research. And so you want to ensure that you have secure, that you secure the IRB approval. Again, as I stated, aiming to recruit but 10% of that sample size for your qualitative methodology. Here, and this is like where, some will say like, oh, it feels like a mini study of your dissertation. Just about every procedure that you're going to utilize in your dissertation process is the same procedures you want to utilize for the pilot study. So if whatever that purposeful sampling strategy is that you propose, and for your full study is the same one you're going to utilize for your pilot study. You're going to develop a recruitment material, whether that's a letter or a digital flyer, depending on the method of my recruitment I utilize both tools. You're going to develop a screening tool to ensure that the participant actually meets criteria, develop an informed consent form, because again, you want to ensure them of what the risks, the benefits are. You want to ensure that you inform them of the purpose. You're going to utilize the same communication modalities. And so if you're going in person, face-to-face, telephone. So for me, I utilize Microsoft Teams. And so that was for my full study and for my pilot study. I just want to really encourage consistency across the board, so that just different nuances while doing the interview and embedding the interview guide, you can have those same ones kind of show up in both of your pilot and your full study. Essentially, take a lot of notes, still record, ensure that that's also in your consent form that you'll be recording, that you're going to be transcribing each interview as well, because again, you want to evaluate to ensure that you're, actually measuring what you're seeking to, responding to the questions that you're actually seeking to measure. Next slide, please. All right. So my process, just as I outlined what that's recommended. So I secured IRB approval on April 13th. My plan, based on my methodology, Mustakas is the individual who was, birthed heuristics. And so he recommends that you can do a heuristics inquiry with one person, but to get a full, view, you can utilize between 1 to 15 individuals. I plan to recruit 1 to 2 co-researchers for the pilot study. I began recruitment on the 18th. My sampling strategy was through criterion sampling. I sent the recruitment flyer and letter to potential participants. I also provided them with a screening tool for them to complete, which I'll show you in the next couple of slides. For the co-researchers that met criteria, I provided them with a consent form. I conducted those interviews via Microsoft Teams, obtained verbal consent before proceeding, proceeding with the interview, and also transcribed as well, utilizing the transcription feature in Microsoft Word. I recorded and transcribed the interviews and took notes to kind of determining, like, did the questions flow well? Were there any long pauses? Did I need to make any rephrases? Did I need to make any modifications to the interview guide while going through the process? And so I'll talk about this a little bit later, but one benefit that I gained was also just, if you're a novice doing research, this also gives you the practice of, getting into the nitty-gritty of doing qualitative research interviews. And so that's one other benefit as well. So I'll talk about that, like I said, a little bit later. Next slide, please. So this is an example of my recruitment flyer. And so again, seeking pilot study participants, and it's clear that my purpose is highlighted. This pilot study is to test the interview guide that will explore the lived experiences of Black counselors during COVID-19 pandemic and civil unrest during 2020, 2021. The criteria in what they can expect, if they agree, a screening tool, how long to actually, for this single participation. So it just kind of spells it out. And essentially, the purpose again is this interview guide collects the appropriate types and ranges of responses, test the questions for readability and comprehension, and ensure that they feel comfortable during the interview process. Next slide, please. Same with this. So this will be the screening questionnaire, and most of my recruitment materials kind of mimicked one another. Obviously, for my full study, the purpose was to assess, the experiences of Black counselors during the two pandemics, and so the terminology changed. This will be the screening tool that I utilized, similar to the purpose that's identified in the flyer that we just saw. Next slide, please. And this is the consent form, please, asking them and letting them know the background of the study, the purpose of the full study, so that they can be aware what the procedures will look like, and then that their agreement to participate is voluntary. In addition to their, that I also informed them that the data collected in the interview will not be utilized in the final data analysis. It was just to vet the interview guide. So I'll talk about that a little bit more later as well, why it's not advisable to utilize the data or the interviewers again in the full study. Next slide, please. All right, so this is my original interview guide. My interview guide was developed utilizing the recommendations from heuristics and my theoretical framework, which was the transactional model of stress and coping, and also with consultation with my methodologist. And so these are my original 9 questions. Next slide, please. So I'll explain a little bit, why I had more than one. So my range of potential participants was 1 to 2 co-researchers. And so this just kind of gives you a little insight about the pilot study participants. Okay. Next slide, please.
And I want to say something here, Crystal, just to highlight. This reflects how you also reported your final data. So even in your pilot study, you're reporting similarly to what you would be reporting. So not only are you getting practice like developing it, implementing it, but you're also getting practice in how you're going to report and figuring out what works and doesn't work in representing your data.
Uh-oh.
Yep, you're here. You're here. We can hear you.
Okay. Oh. All right. Uh-oh. Okay. I think Dr. Gibson is frozen, so I'm gonna start.
Lost hers. Put up on my end. Hold on, give me a second.
All right, I have it as well.
Okay, you want to do it? Yeah.
Yeah, I got it. 1 second, guys.
Gotta love technology.
Right, there we go. Okay, give me a second here.
Quick
All
recovery,
right.
Crystal. I'm impressed.
It was already just had to just slide it over. So we'll give this a little time to so what should be loading, hopefully. Okay, there we go. Is my original interview guide, as I stated, was developed based off my theoretical framework and also heuristics as recommendations by Mustakas, 1990 or something like that. I can reference the years if you have questions later. So here's the outcome of my pilot study. So essentially, with my first co-researcher, and I'm just kind of like laying out where the tricky, where, I had the most hiccups in my questionnaire. So question one yielded an appropriate response. Question two, in my original interview guide stated, how would you describe your professional stressors? How have they changed since 2020? Right off the bat, based on the individual's response. And so it did not successfully yield an appropriate response. The goal of the question was to evaluate the general stress of the Black counselor prior to the pandemic. However, the co-researcher began to discuss potential stress related to the two pandemics. And so given and as I have highlighted below, given the co-researcher's response, I asked her to pause for a moment. I had both, thankfully I had both copies of, there was so I will want to comment here is that you oftentimes will have multiple drafts of your interview guide, because you're not just going to write down like, yeah, let me ask these 10 questions. You're going to be, wanting to ensure that one, that they align with your theoretical framework. So again, I use the transactional model, Stress and Coping by Lazarus and Falkman, 1980 something, four probably. And in that, I wanted to ensure that it aligned with my theoretical framework, and also that it also aligned with what was recommended for my methodology. So given those factors, there were going to be some rewrites. So I had a couple of different drafts, but the most recent draft I had, I was like, let me pause and let me ask this question again. So I rephrased the question. I provided the co-researcher with some feedback and modified the question as such. How would you compare that prior to the pandemic? So the co-researcher responded to the original question, and then how would you compare the stressors prior to the pandemic? And then the co-researcher's response aligned more with the goal of my question that I had identified. And so this was a question I had in the previous draft, was prior to the COVID-19 pandemic and civil unrest, how would you describe your professional stress? So it's burnout, compassion fatigue, and secondary traumatic stress. And so we, continued through the flow of the questions, and even through the process of doing it with the co-researchers, I would ask like, how was that flow for you? Take time, pause, make notes, notice if they were taking some time to think a little bit, if I had to rephrase it, so that I was being very observant, utilizing those counseling skills for the nonverbals. I was giving them that time for the silence and pause. And if they asked me to restate, I would try to restate it in another way, in another framework. I noted during this first interview that questions 3 through 9 did yield the response that I was looking for. However, at that point, I determined that it would be essential for me to interview an additional co-researcher. So pilot study interview was with co-researcher number 2. So I want to highlight as well that between both interviews, I, again, consulted previous versions, drafts of my interview. The most recent draft that me and my methodologist had completed together, and determined that there was a couple of questions that I wanted to, I wonder, should I test like these questions? So during the second pilot interview, instead of 9 questions, I presented 11 questions, which were just different versions of the same one, rewrites, just to see which one flowed best. So the co-researcher was asked 2 versions of question 2. So 2A was, how would you describe your professional stressors? How have they changed since 2020? And 2B was, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic and civil unrest, how would you describe your professional stressors? Spelling it out: burnout, compassion fatigue, and secondary traumatic stress. Another question that, in my review again of my previous draft, the co-researcher was asked 2 versions of question 3. Since the COVID-19 pandemic and civil unrest, what dimensions of the experience have impacted your level of professional stress? And 3B, since the COVID-19 pandemic and civil unrest, how would you describe your experience of burnout, compassion fatigue, and secondary traumatic stress? So similar questions. However, it was essential for me to test and see which one yielded the most appropriate response of what I was looking to measure. I was looking at counselor wellness, burnout, compassion fatigue, and secondary traumatic stress are subsets of counselor impairment and wellness. I decided to test the 3B, which was for my original draft, with the second pilot study co-researcher and with the pseudonym Diane, to see if it flowed best with question 2, because again, it was important for me to ensure that there was like some chronology. How was your stress before? How was your stress after? 2B, however, in question 3A was eliminated because co-researcher number 2 did not understand the question. So she kind of asked me to restate it a couple of times. And at that point, I was like, okay, 3B might be have a better flow, be more readable, and yield an appropriate response that was anticipated. So overall, questions 2 and B were the best fit for 2B, and 3B were the best fits for the interview guide. So this was my final interview guide. So I would say one of the best practices, a lot of notes, re-examine your interview notes, your recordings, your transcripts, just to kind of notice like anything in particular, like, not really sure that that's, related, relevant. Consider how well each interview was conducted, and consider how the interview might be improved in the full study. So benefits of using a pilot study, I would say first as a researcher, as I stated before, as a novice researcher, so if you hadn't been conducting a lot of research practice, and in particular qualitative research, this gives you a better understanding of the research process. Additionally, the researcher can self-assess and determine their readiness, their ability, and their commitment to their study. I understand the dissertation, you're like, I'm ready, I'm committed, I need to get this done. But you also want to make sure that like, have I done my due diligence to ensure that this aligns with my methodology, my theoretical orientation, things of that nature. It also improves the researcher's comfort and competence in facilitating and utilizing an interview guide. I can say when I walked into like my first full study interview, I'm like, hey, I know this. And because one of the goals that's essential in qualitative research is you, the researcher, is also the instrument. That's number one. But also number two, you want to also have a conversational interview. It doesn't want to feel very sterile. You don't want it to feel like, okay, next question. You want it to have a really good flow. And so with that, these are some of the benefits to the researcher. Some of the benefits to participants, one of the practical components that I identified that you can really determine the time commitment so that when you're communicating, it's not just a rough estimate. You can know like, okay, I actually did two, 1 to 2 interviews. I can really say like, hey, because people are donating their time to participate in your studies. And so it's essential that you're able to communicate them, what they can expect and as far as their commitment to provide for the interview. You can ensure that your participants feel comfortable through the interview process. And so, if there was any questions that made them feeling uncomfortable, this can be something that you can kind of like test for in that in your pilot study. And also it's kind of like a member checking element in the early part of your and during a pilot study, because the participants are actively involved in the development of your interview guide. So you're asking them for their opinion in the moment, did you understand that? You can also again like assess for those different nuances that you can see through their nonverbals as well. And so, as stated, as the goals, there are essentially the benefits for the full study. Assuring that it collects the appropriate types of ranges of questions. Ensure that the researcher, there is readability and comprehension. If you need to make changes and modifications or add any additional prompts, those can be added to improve the flow and the conversational nature. It allows, again, for those revisions and identify any practical issues with the transcription and data analysis and a data interpretation process. And so you can kind of also, problem solve for those different factors. So some of the limitations, oftentimes you may have a minimum homogeneous participants that may not fully represent your study. So for my pilot study, I had two Black females. The only, I think, difference was probably like location and maybe licensure type, only because their licenses across state was different. And so and during my full study, I had a very array of different individuals that participated in my study. One of the other components, as I mentioned earlier, limitation is that you will not utilize, as I spelled out in my consents and my screening tool, my flyers, is that the findings, the data collected, so their responses will not be analyzed and included in the final findings of the study. One, because if with my pilot study co-researcher one, I'm asking one question, I'm asking my number two and my number three questions were very different. So the data is going to be inaccurate and faulty. So the response is not going to align with the final findings. And so for that reason, it's not recommended, or it's definitely not recommended to utilize it. Additionally, the inability to utilize the participants in the full study as well, because for that reason, you're probably going to cross the lines of responder bias, where because they already know what your questions are, they're going to respond in a socially desirable way. So it's essential that they're not that you don't utilize the same participants from the pilot study and the full study. And then it's not very feasible with some qualitative methodologies. And I mentioned, like with case studies, like if you're doing like a single one, are you going to do two single ones? So it's almost like repeating the study. And then with some like narrative and ethnographic, if you're collecting like primarily artifacts and looking at data and documents and not doing, if you just have like a single storyteller, this may not be the methodology for that. And so Dr. Gibson and I, Dr. Ginevra, wanted to let you know, like, so like, hey, I have these two options to do, whether it's going to be a Delphi or a pilot study. And so I think you're back. Ginevra, would you share some
Yes.
reasons why you would encourage the use of a Delphi?
Yes. So if in trying to determine which one is going to be most helpful, if you're considering the Delphi, one of the reasons that I chose the Delphi is because I was pulling from a lot of existing constructs and theories. And while I was exploring an area that there wasn't a lot of research around, or let's say a specific part of or population that there wasn't a lot of research around, there was a lot of research around microaggressions and intersectionality and pieces like that. So there was a lot of constructs that I was pulling from. And so because of that, the Delphi was very helpful in help in me making sure that I was staying consistent with those existing constructs and theories. So again, if you're pulling from a lot of existing elements, it's going to be helpful. Whereas, so I did a case study for my research, and so it worked well because I was looking at a bounded system, and so this was very helpful in helping me to define what was happening within that system. Now, if you are doing something like a grounded theory and you are going into uncharted territories or creating a theory, this may be helpful if you want consensus on how to create the theory, but it's not necessarily going to be helpful in determining what that theory is, right? So we're pulling from existing constructs, and the Delphi is very helpful with getting that consensus around those things, especially too if you're having different constructs that are intersecting or different theories that are intersecting. You can pull diverse opinions from diverse groups of experts. And so if that's something that you're needing, a Delphi is going to be very helpful. It's essentially, again, like I said before, a focus group. And so if you need that focus group input, again, this is going to be very helpful for you. Also, if you're exploring like a controversial issue within existing theories, or looking at where there might be limited research in that, maybe, again, I had a lot the background of my research, there's lots there, but I was looking at a piece where there wasn't a whole lot. And so I wanted to make sure that my research connected back to those constructs. So looking at a place where there's limited research within a larger body of research. And then also if you're measuring diversity of opinion, and so you want to find through your process, again, this may or may not be where your dissertation goes, but if you're looking for a place where experts don't necessarily agree, or you're needing to get a lot of diverse opinions on something more complex, this is going to be also a helpful way to validate your instrument in your research.
And so for a pilot study, I would say, based on, my evaluation of different methodologies, but I believe that a pilot study will be essential for phenomenological grounded theory or heuristics, given that, if you're looking at, a population of about 10 to, 15 people, I know for grounded theory can be a little bit more, that, just testing that questionnaire, with 1 to 2 participants, I think will be essential for these types of qualitative methodologies. Also, if you're exploring, I would say that a pilot study would be great if you're exploring a recent, new, or acute phenomena. In my particular study, given that it was a pandemic, given these two pandemics as I defined them, happening at the same time, I think it was essential to utilize a pilot study for that reason. And then looking at that last point, is also to assess the relevancy with potential participants, because you're like, hey, this is important to me. Is this relevant to other individuals? And it can help, determine those factors as well. And so, all right. So here are our resources.
And one thing I would add about the pilot that another student has done, yep, that's all right, Crystal. But another student that is in this cohort, Oaks, she is doing case study, but it's pretty heuristic as well in the sense of her connections to the study. And she actually had her subject matter expert administer her interview guide to her as a pseudo pilot. And I will say that was really powerful too. She said that it really gave her an opportunity to experience the pilot, to experience the interview guides as a participant. I mean, of course, her data didn't go into the research, but it impacted the way that she reflected on things as a, co-researcher, participant, being the researcher. And so I think that that was another powerful element that I would encourage people to consider, especially if you have a strong connection to what you're studying. I think that it helps you also figure out what your existing biases are so that you can bracket those in some way and at least be aware of them as you're going through, so that you're not just hearing that part of the story and not hearing the rest of the story that your participants may be, sharing. So I think that that was a really powerful process for Oaks to experience the interview herself. Yeah. So I guess we'll open it up for questions. Maybe anybody? Tyler?
Yeah, I don't have any questions. I had questions, but you answered all of them along the way. That's really good presentation. Just want to say that. Congratulations on completing your degree.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ty.
Okay. All right. Dr. Bumpini, do you have any comments?
So sometimes you have to also convince skeptical faculty that pilot studies are a good idea. So fun fact, I was Dr. Gibson's methodologist. And when she said, Dr. LA and I, we're going to do a Delphi. And I said, no. And she's like, yes. And I'm like, no, we're not doing this because it's going to take forever. And you want to graduate and you have a job offer dangling. No. And she's like, we have to trust the process. This is a good thing. And I was like, okay, and I'm changing things. Like she has a draft and it's like 80+%. And I'm like crossing on like 70. And she's like, well, we could say 70, but I'm trying to get 80. I'm like, why are you making this harder than it has to be? I feel the need for speed. Let's go, let's go, let's go. And I will say I am now convinced, and bless my 736 section, because I'm like, we're all doing pilots, we're all doing Delphi's, we're doing it, we're doing all the things. And so that's where I am now. I am a convert, because at first I was like, I see red flags and I am not a person who bleaches red flags white. So I was like, I'm like, we can bail at any given. You're like, come on now. She's like, I'm gonna trust the process. And then something kind of went wrong. I'm like, see, I told you this was a terrible idea. Like, I was really not here for it. So sometimes you will have to drag along skeptical professionals who are like, this is gonna get ugly. So I'm glad, because I will say the one great thing about being a counselor and being a counselor educator is we're always learning, we're always growing. There's more things that we can do to make our research more robust, and don't be afraid to try something new. Because that's what we're trying to do anyway. We're trying to research, we're trying to experiment, we're trying to learn. So don't be afraid of something like a pilot or a Delphi, or doing a CFA after EFA or something like that. Like, you just have to kind of embrace it. And what better time to do it than when you're doing your dissertation, you have support.
And I would say that's a really good demonstration too of, your committee are going to have differences of opinions, and that you have to remember it is your research, and that ultimately you have to advocate for that. And you've got to create present the support. So present the, arguments for why you want to do something and how it's going to make it better, but also be open to listening to what the committee has to say. Ginevra had two very different opinions in her ear. She had me on one side and she had Dr. Monfini on the other side. And, it was okay for us to disagree. Crystal?
I can also say that I had the same experience between you and my methodologist, who will remain nameless. Like, I will I will protect their identity. I will also comment that I saw the benefit of, like, I think it aided by going through this process initially, it aided my analysis process, because if I had those original questions, I wouldn't have been measuring what I was looking to measure. And so so in producing my findings, I know that I was able to actually look what I was looking at, what I was supposed to look at.
Yeah. And Dr. Easley, you had a comment when you want to share?
Oh, I was just saying, I wish I had known about this when I was doing my dissertation, because I did a qualitative feminological, and it was also something I was a part of the population that I was studying. So I think that this could have been super helpful.
Yeah.
So, thank you for
Yeah.
sharing.
Yeah, and I'll say one additional benefit with the Delphi is, well, of course, I reached out to a lot of people in the field, and at the point where I had finished my literature review and all those things, I was kind of like fangirling, like these people who had done all this research, right? And then, I didn't get responses from some, and then I was super grateful for those who did participate. But when I went to ACES, I got to interact with some of them, and we already had like a basis of like understanding, and they knew who I was, and they remembered helping and all those things. So it was really cool to also connect with my other researchers that had done work in what I was doing. And it just allowed for further connections within the field.
Yes.
And then they went to Ginevra's presentation at ACES and stood in the back with a big smile on their faces, like, I contributed to this masterpiece. Right? It was great. It was great. So it comes full circle.
Yes.
Absolutely.
All right. Any other thoughts or questions, comments, Tyler?
It's crazy. I actually didn't know what this was about today. I just showed up, and I've been reading about Delphi studies and trying to learn about that on my own.
I
It's
actually
just like
shared the article you shared with me. I sent to Ginevra. So
okay, cool.
yeah.
Yeah, so this feels very serendipitous. But I guess a question for the faculty: can a student do a Delphi study for their dissertation?
No.
Okay.
It can be a part of your dissertation, but it can't be the dissertation. It's like you can't do focus groups. You can't do just a Delphi. You're not going to be able to do for quantitative t-test or just a one-way ANOVA. It has to be robust. It has to have some, some substantive action to it. Yeah.
It seems
Now
like a
we
really
have
clear
had,
cut.
yeah, there's one study that I wish could have been, in my opinion, more robust because they ended up using Poisson's regression, which is kind of like a regressive chi-square. It's the best way I can describe it. But in that situation, the student was studying suicide, and you can't study that in weight, right? Like you can only look back on it archivally. So with archival studies, it has to be something that it would not be ethical or legal to study during the action, right? Like suicide, for example.
Okay. Yeah, for what I'm interested in with the constructed awareness typology, from what I'm reading about the Delphi study, that would be such a straightforward way to explore that, to get consensus on the different traits for the type. So maybe I can reach out to you.
Yeah, exactly.
See
We have
if
some
there's a
other
way to pursue
ways.
that.
We can do Delphi plus something with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
And you may have an opportunity to develop that in 738 some more time. So
Let's do it. Yeah.
yeah. All right. Other questions, comments? Didn't see any in the chat. All right. Well, I just want to give a huge thanks. I was having a proud moment while I was watching the two of you. Oh my goodness. I was like talking to Dr. Bonfini a little in chat, like, I'm so proud of them. I'm having a moment. So this has been wonderful. And I just want to thank you for sharing your expertise and for sharing your time with us. I know it's a late night, and it really means a lot for you to come back and do this for us. So thank you again. So. All
Well,
right.
thank you both. I won't speak for Crystal, but I have so much just admiration and love for the two of you. And so thank you for having us.
Yeah, I can echo. I echo.
All right. And if you're going to SACES, be on the lookout. We're putting in a proposal for this for SACES, and hopefully we'll be writing a journal article in the near future on this as well. So we want to get the word out on how to, validate, create rigor, trustworthiness, and quality in the qualitative instruments. So have a good night, everybody. And this will be on our YouTube channel by next week.